Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 4 of Stray Dog Footy. My name is Frodo, and I am still quarantined down here in Florida. Thank you so much for clicking in, and I want you to know just how much I appreciate you taking the time to listen to this podcast. Before we get into today's subject matter, I need to do a little bit of housekeeping. Kudos to Matt Dean for picking up on the fact that I incorrectly stated in last week's episode that the Hawthorn Hawks joined the league in 1902. What I meant to say was that the Hawks were actually formed in 1902. They did not, however, join the league until 1925. Thanks for keeping me honest, Matt. Also, thanks go out to Rosanna of the AFL Obsessed for the shout out on her podcast. One thing I love about AFL fans here in the US of A is that even though we may cheer for different teams, we all support each other in sharing our love for this crazy and amazing sport we've found. If you haven't already, you should definitely check out her stuff, and a link is in the show notes. I also have to give a shout out of my own to Isabel Huntington of the Western Bulldogs AFLW team. If you don't know, Izzy was the number 1 draft pick for the club back in 2017, and her promise was great. She is also one of the loveliest and most humble young ladies you could ever meet, and it was my great pleasure and honor to do so last year. Unfortunately, a series of devastating injuries has kept her on the sideline for much of her professional career. But she has battled through, and this past week she was awarded both an All-Australian and a NAB Rising Star Award for her outstanding play during the 2020 season. And as if that wasn't enough, she was just named as the Western Bulldogs' Best and Fairest, arguably the top honor footy clubs give out. Congratulations, Iz. Well deserved. Okay, now on with the show. Today's episode I'm calling Tom Wills, Australia's Abner Doubleday? ? In case you haven't heard about Tom Wills, I'll get to him in just a moment. But I'm sure many Americans have heard about Abner Doubleday. He was a capable Union general during the American Civil War, known to have, among other things, commanded Fort Sumter during the very first shots fired in the bloody conflict. And a decade and a half after his death in 1893, though there apparently is no record of him making a single mention of it while he was alive, he was credited with the invention of baseball. Now, just like General Doubleday, Tom Wills was also alive during the American Civil War, though on the opposite side of the world in Australia. However, unlike old Abner, evidence strongly suggests that Tom Wills did in fact help invent his country's favorite pastime, Australian Rules Football. Disclaimer time, I am no authority on Tom Wills. There have been many books written that detail his extraordinary life, tragic death, and lasting impact on Australian sport. I'm sure most, if not all, do a much better job of it than my abridged and ham-fisted attempt here. But my aim is to briefly introduce Tom Wills to those who don't know anything about him, and to encourage people to go on to learn more about this most flamboyant and iconic, yet often unknown figure of Australian history. Thomas Wentworth Wills was born on August 19, 1835, in the then British penal colony of New South Wales, close to where the Australian capital of Canberra is located today. 3 out of his 4 grandparents had been convicts shipped to Australia. Yet his grandfather, who had actually been spared execution for armed robbery, his sentence commuted to transportation, had done quite well for himself once he became a free man. And his son Horatio Wills and his wife Elizabeth had risen to some prominence in the colony themselves. Horatio, a devoutly religious man, had become an editor for the Sydney Gazette newspaper, and was well connected with the local bigwigs and politicians. In fact, young Thomas had been named after William Wentworth, a well-known statesman. Yet, despite all this, with Tom still just a child, Horatio moved the family south to where he had acquired grazing land. the family becoming some of the very first white settlers of present-day Victoria. Tom grew up as an athletic but occasionally sickly kid. Being an only child at the time, in the bush, Tom spent much of his childhood with the local Aboriginal children. His ability to learn their language, customs, songs, and games was remarkable, greatly endearing him to the indigenous population. In 1846, Tom began to attend school in Melbourne, and this is where he was first introduced to the game of cricket, something that would change his, and indeed millions of lives, forever. 3 years later, he finished up his schooling in Victoria, but his father had much grander plans for him. In 1850, at the mere age of 14, Tom was shipped off to Rugby School in England, perhaps the most prestigious school in the country at that time. His father was adamant that young Thomas receive a classical education. It was his hope that his eldest son would go on to study law at Cambridge University, and that Tom would return to Australia a man of eminence, perhaps to one day become a great statesman himself. After a 5.5-month journey, alone on a steamer ship, Tom arrived in London and then went on to his boarding school. Within a week, he was on his house's cricket team, soon dominating in both bowling and batting. Though his bowling style may have been unusual, even controversial, his performance soon helped elevate rugby to the top of the competition. It was also at this time that Tom began playing his school's variant of football, an early version of the rough sport that would eventually take its name from Tom's school. Tom excelled at kicking and evading tackles, and by the time he was 16 years old, his height and physique was impressive. As well as he was doing on the field, in the classroom he was beginning to fall behind, much to his father's dismay. He also had grown homesick and would decorate his dorm room with Australian and Aboriginal items. Despite this, in 1855, at almost 20 years of age, Tom finished his schooling. However, instead of studying at Cambridge as his father had wished, he instead spent the next year and a half playing cricket for several universities, traveling to Ireland, and living a rather lavish lifestyle on his father's money. Eventually conceding that Tom was not going to be studying law at Cambridge, Horatio finally had enough and called him home to Australia. Victoria was a much different place when Tom Wills arrived home just before Christmas in 1856. What had been a small port when he left was now the center of the Victorian gold rush. But gold fever wasn't the only action in town. What was on everyone's lips in the 1850s Victoria was cricket. Tom could not have returned home at a more opportune time. To appease his father, Tom took a job at a law firm in Melbourne, but never practiced law. He simply had no interest in it. But his reputation as an elite sportsman was of great interest to everyone, especially with the promise Tom held for the hotly contested inter-colony cricket competitions between Victoria and New South Wales. It was not long before Tom rose to prominence in Australian cricket. He was known for his flamboyant dress, dominating performance, and a muscular frame that was said to make women swoon. In 1858, he captained the Victorian team to victory over New South Wales at the MCG, and he was the talk of the town, being hailed as the greatest cricketer in the land. Tom served as secretary for the Melbourne Cricket Club for the 1957-58 cricket season. However, once again, his prowess was on the field, not off it, and his poor management led to much conflict and he left the club. Likewise, though he enjoyed an elite amateur status among his peers, he also enjoyed socializing with the professional players as well, something that rubbed many sporting purists the wrong way. His was a large personality, part colonial sports hero, part sex symbol, part larrikin, combined with a classical education from one of the finest schools in England. As such, he often wrote letters to various publications, perhaps most prolifically to Cricketing Rags. On July 10, 1958, one particularly important letter from Tom Wills was published, and in it, in part, he wrote, "Sir, now that cricket has been put aside for some few months to come, and cricketers have assumed somewhat of the chrysalis nature, for a time only 'tis true, but at length again will burst forth in all their varied hues, rather than allow this state of torpor to creep over them, and stifle their new supple limbs, why can they not, I say, form a football club, and form a committee of 3 or more to draw up a code of laws? If a club of this sort were got up, it would be of vast benefit to any cricket grounds to be trampled upon, and would make the turf quite firm and durable. Besides which, it would keep those who are inclined to become stout from having their joints encased in useless, superabundant flesh." Translated into today's plain English, he was basically saying, hey guys, maybe we can organize some kind of football sport where we can keep our cricketers from going soft and fat over the winter. And besides, it's going to be good for the grass. Much like in England, there had been various forms of football played from time to time in Victoria, dating back to the 1820s. It was usually a one-time affair, and no formal rules or leagues had been formed. In fact, the rules would often be agreed upon by the teams on the day of the match, and there was much variety as time went on and different locations were utilized. A few weeks after Tom's letter was published, on Saturday, August 7th, 1958, the first game of what would eventually become Australian Rules Football was played on Richmond Paddock beside the MCG. The two sides playing were Scotch College versus Melbourne Grammar School. Each side nominated an umpire, and Tom Wills was selected as one of them. The match went on for 3 days, the second day of play taking place 2 weekends later, August 21st, and the third day, again 2 weeks later, on Saturday, September 4th. The exact rules utilized for this contest remain lost to history, but what is believed to be true is that the match was played with a round ball. The pairs of gum trees that were used as goals were about half a mile apart. There were 40 players for each team, and the games lasted a grueling 5 hours. In the end, the match was declared a tie, each side scoring a single goal on the first day, and none during the following 2 games. Another cricket season later, on May 17, 1859, Tom Wills gathered some associates together at the Parade Hotel in Melbourne. Drawn up were 10 rules known as the Rules of the Melbourne Football Club. As far as anyone can find written proof, this was the first time ever a football code was officially written down and, more importantly, widely distributed. Before both the current codes of rugby, before American football, before Gaelic football, and even before soccer. The 10 rules were as follows. 1. The distance between the goals and the goalposts shall be decided upon by the captains of the sides playing. 2. The captains on each side shall toss for choice of goal. The side losing the toss has the kick-off from the center point between the goals. 3. A goal must be kicked fairly between the posts, without touching either of them, or a portion of the person of any player on either side. 4. The game shall be played within a space of not more than 200 yards wide, the same to be measured equally on each side of a line drawn through the centers of the 2 goals. And 2 posts, to be called the kick-off posts, shall be erected at a distance of 20 yards on each side of the goalposts at both ends, and in a straight line with them. 5. In case the ball is kicked behind goal, any one of the side behind whose goal it is kicked may bring it 20 yards in front of any portion of the space between the kick-off posts, and shall kick it as nearly as possible in line with the opposite goal. 6. Any player catching the ball directly from the foot may call mark. He then has a free kick, no player from the opposite side being allowed to come inside the spot marked. 7. Tripping and pushing are both allowed, but no hacking. When any player is in rapid motion or in possession of the ball, except in the case provided for in Rule 6. 8. The ball may be taken in hand only when caught from the foot or on the hop. In no case shall it be lifted from the ground. 9. When a ball goes out of bounds, the same being indicated by a row of posts, it shall be brought back to the point where it crossed the boundary line and thrown in at right angles with that line. 10. The ball, while in play, may under no circumstances be thrown. Well, there you have the earliest codified form of Australian rules football. But there is some disagreement and controversy about where Tom Wills and his fellows drew their inspiration. It seems obvious that Wills relied heavily on the form of football he had played during his time at rugby school. But he had also stated that he wanted a less violent version to prevent injuries to his cricketers. In addition, the codes of at least 3 other English schools were looked at as well. What is less obvious is that during his time with the Aboriginal people, as a child in the bush, it is likely that he observed, or even possibly played, various indigenous ball games called Marn Grook. Games which share many similar characteristics with Australian rules football. Some historians argue that there is no record of Tom Wills mentioning Aboriginal games when it came to football. Others counter with that even so, due to the prevalent racism, fear, and hatred at the time, Tom Wills would never have tried to push a black sport on his white Victorian footballers, even if some elements had indeed been borrowed from Marn Grook. I am inclined to believe the latter is, in the very least, possible. For the next few years, he continued to play, promote, and refine football, and his falling out with the MCC did nothing to diminish his reputation and demand as a cricketer. Something of a gun for hire, he would play for various clubs, usually tipping the scales in his side's favor. He also retained his captaincy of the Victorian colonial team. Tom Wills was at the height of his celebrity when he suddenly announced his retirement from sport. At his father Horatio's request, he would accompany him to found and manage some new property the family had acquired in the outback of Queensland. As a dutiful Victorian son, Tom obeyed and set about preparing himself for the long journey. And it was a course of action that would change his life forever. In early 1861, Tom, now 26, his father Horatio, and a party of his father's employees and their families traveled by ship to Brisbane. Then, after picking up livestock and supplies, set out on an 8-month trek to their land. It was a dangerous and difficult journey. 1 man drowned. Food was scarce, and they needed to forage and hunt as they went. Along the way, they also acquired 10,000 sheep that they drove to their property. The large group did not go unnoticed by the local Aborigines, yet Horatio had high hopes of managing their relationship with the indigenous population. Arriving at their enormous sheep farm at a place called Colinlaringo in early October, they set up camp. 2 weeks later, Tom left the property with a few men to retrieve some supplies they had left behind during their long trek. On October 17, 1861, the camp was attacked by Aborigines, and 19 settlers were killed, including women and children, as well as Horatio Wills. Only 1 man had survived to tell the tale when Tom and his party returned to the ravaged farm a few days later. Tom was in shock and distraught beyond belief. He wanted to avenge his father's murder. Yet, when word reached neighboring properties and the police and vigilante squads were formed, he is not believed to have taken part in the retribution killings that followed. The exact number of Aborigines who were killed is not known, but estimates range from 70 to 300. It was later learned that the Colinla Massacre, as the attack on the Wills farm would come to be called, may actually itself have been a reprisal for an earlier attack on the indigenous population by other settlers. It remains the deadliest attack of white settlers by Aborigines in Australian history. After the massacre, Tom Wills was never really the same. Today, we would recognize the symptoms of his descending state of mind as post-traumatic stress disorder. Though he tried to rebuild the farm as his father would have wanted, he stopped sleeping well at night, awakening with nightmares, always keeping a weapon by his side and constantly on the lookout for another attack. Tom's alcohol consumption, which had started at rugby and had only grown with his sporting celebrity, dramatically increased in an attempt to soothe his troubled mind. This did not sit well with his family, nor the farm's trustees, as Tom seemingly drank up the profits. And, coupled with his extended absences from the farm to again play cricket in Sydney and football in Victoria, he eventually was dismissed from managing the family farm in Colinla in 1864. Returning to Victoria, Tom played for and captained football teams for both Melbourne and Geelong during the 1865 season. Later that year, he once again captained the underdog Victorian colonial cricket team to victory over New South Wales. In 1866, most likely in need of money as his relationship with his family had become increasingly estranged, Tom Wills took a job recruiting and coaching an all-Aboriginal team of cricketers to play against the Melbourne Cricket Club on Boxing Day. He traveled deep inland and selected a team of station workers. Much to their surprise, their dialect was close enough to that of what Tom had learned as a child, and he was actually able to coach them the game of cricket in their own language. Unfortunately, even though the team was captained by Tom Wills, they were defeated by the MCC. But the team earned much praise for their effort and started a dialogue about the mistreatment of Aboriginals in general. Tom Wills himself was of course always the topic of discussion. Many saw him as a traitor for mingling with blacks after his father's murder, but to others he was a hero for the same reason. The team did improve, however, and Wills went on tour with them throughout Australia for some time. Unfortunately, it eventually fell apart due to financial problems and some unscrupulous profiteers. Many of these players, however, went on to rejoin the team under a new manager. This Aboriginal squad actually toured Britain from May to October of 1868, the first Australian cricket team to ever return to the motherland. For the next decade or so, Tom played cricket and football whenever he could, sought work as an umpire and other work around sports, but his financial situation was becoming more and more desperate while his alcoholism grew ever more severe. He was no longer able to afford club dues and had written letters to his family asking for money to help him pay off his debts. Once the center of the Melbourne sporting scene, Tom's popularity and reputation was gradually but surely sliding into obscurity. At the end of April 1880, Tom Wills and a longtime female companion abruptly stopped drinking, most likely due to not having the money to pay for more alcohol. A few days later, on May 1st, he began showing symptoms of alcohol withdrawal and was admitted to the Melbourne Hospital and received treatment for delirium tremens. Later that evening, he escaped from the hospital and returned home. The next day, on Sunday, May 2nd, undoubtedly out of his mind with hallucinations, he committed suicide by stabbing himself in the heart with a pair of scissors. Tom was buried the following day with a simple ceremony and an unmarked grave, his funeral attended by a mere 6 people. His devoutly religious family considered his lifestyle and suicide sinful, and thus shunned his memory. In fact, it is said his mother never mentioned him as her son again. For 100 years, Thomas Wentworth Wills lay largely forgotten until a new appreciation began to emerge due to his connection with Australian Rules Football. In 1980, his gravesite was restored and a new tombstone was placed with funds raised by the Melbourne Cricket Club. He has since been honoured with being an inductee into the Sport Australia Hall of Fame in 1989 and the Australian Football League Hall of Fame in 1996. In 2001, a statue of Tom Wills was erected outside the MCG depicting him umpiring that first game on Richmond Paddock. Various other venues, events, and infrastructure have now been named in his honor. And, in 2016, the Tom Wills Project raised $15,000 to restore his grave once again. But most importantly, his legacy lives on in every single match of Australian rules football. I hope I have done this remarkable man's life some small measure of justice. I believe one should measure a man's life in its entirety, not merely on how it ends. And I hope we can all appreciate just how far the game we love has come since that fateful day in the park beside the MCG. As always, I sincerely thank you for listening, and I would really appreciate it if you would consider sharing, posting, and linking to this podcast. I really try to pour my heart and soul into these episodes, and it means so much to me when people take the time to listen. Also, I would love to hear your comments and suggestions. You can reach me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Stray Dog Footy, and by email at straydogfooty@yahoo.com. Just wanted to quickly mention that I am not endorsed by the Australian Football League or the Western Bulldogs Football Club beyond being a huge fan and supporter. Likewise, I am not endorsed nor affiliated with Peg and the Rejected, but I am a fan of their music. As always, I would like to thank them for the use of their song Red, White, Black and Blue, which I used a portion of as the intro to this episode. I will also play the entire song at the end of the episode. I will, of course, leave a link in the show notes to their music. And by the way, they have also just released an instrumental album, and I should provide a link to that as well. Take care, friends, and I hope to see you back next time on Stray Dog Footy.